Well, I think it's fair to say that did not go exactly as I thought it would. Hi, and welcome to Khyber Shards, a 5th edition actual play set in the Eberron campaign world. It's Friday. We're doing a Khyber Shards answer. I should say I'm on my own. I want to talk a bit about the last episode and the immensely long combat encounter that we ran. We don't usually, or I don't usually edit much. This one I edited a good deal because it was all a combat encounter, and in any given combat encounter, you get a good bit of, all right, it's your turn. Right. And our recording ran 2 hours or more. It was bonkers. So I edited a lot of that out and got it down to just over an hour and a half. So it was a long fight. I want to analyze a little bit of what I thought would happen, why I think it didn't happen, and analyze a little bit about why I think the players did what they did. But before I do that, I just feel like it's really important for me to say that this is not, none of this is criticism. This is just analysis. I want to kind of look at what the players did, why I think they did it, why I did what I did or didn't do what I didn't do. We'll deal with some questions that way. But I don't actually think anybody did anything wrong. Well, we muffed a couple of rules at various points, but that happens, and especially late in the encounter. It was real late. We pushed midnight recording this, and any kind of long combat encounter like that, your brain just gets real tired. So we screwed up a few of the rules. But again, not in any way that I would call super important. So yeah. But beyond that, I don't think anybody did anything wrong. I'm not saying that. I just want to talk about why I think it went the way it did. So let's start with what I thought would, or what I kind of planned this for. We'd had a couple episodes that were kind of heavy, and so I wanted to give them a fun, light combat encounter. So my intention was bad guys walk in. There's a blocking team that runs up, engages the party in combat, while the bad guy goes in, gets the thing he's looking for, goes back out. I was thinking I had marked out how long it would take him because I think that's a good way to be fair. And I'll talk about why I am inclined toward, I don't usually worry about balance. I don't usually worry about the word fair. I usually think the word fair is used in D&D mostly as an excuse to tell someone they're playing wrong. Combat encounters are the only area where I tend to try to be fair, and I will, well, I'll tell you why. It's simply that you want to reward player ingenuity. Always. You always want to reward player ingenuity. And when you, cheat's the wrong word, when you fudge things for the sake of an encounter, or even for the sake of story in combat, you risk, you don't always, and you can do that without doing this, but you risk frustrating your players because it feels like the clever thing they just thought of or the good use of their ability was invalidated. And that messes with player fun. And I don't ever want to mess with player fun as long as that fun is, not being a punk or anything like that. But you know what I mean? So I had it marked out. Round, come in, announce. Round 2, go in, find the thing. Round 3, get the thing, begin to move out. Round 4, get to the door. Round 5, out the door. Round 6, gone. that's the rough outline, I think. I'm not looking at my notes, but that was my rough way of going out. Now 6 rounds is a lot of combat. That's a long D&D combat. And my estimation was, if the players engaged the blockers primarily, then they would just be getting to the bad guy when he escaped. In my defense, I feel like that was still a pretty good estimation, because the bad guy had a lot of tools for slowing the players down, which he made use of some of, and the blockers had some capabilities that I didn't use very effectively, and I'll talk about that here in a second, that would have slowed things down a little bit as well. Here's where it went wrong for me. It went wrong because of something that happened in at least some, I think kind of all, but at least some of the players' minds. And that is, my players know narrative. There's a bit of metagaming that happened here. And that's usually used negatively, and I'm not using it negatively here. I'm using it as just a reality of playing D&D, because D&D is a game. So when you think about it beyond in any way beyond what your character knows, then you're metagaming, and your character doesn't know they're a character in a game, so you're always metagaming to a little bit. In this case, here's what the metagaming was. This guy announces himself. Ooh, he used the name Coolseer. Ooh, name drop. Okay. He goes, he gets that thing. That thing must be important later. So we have to stop that guy. Because if we just think about it from a character perspective, to be real honest, my opinion, and I don't have a player here, so I don't want to overdo this, but in my opinion, it makes no sense at all for this group of characters to decide, I'm going to risk my life to stop that guy from stealing that spear. The stakes are not obviously high here. The spear is not obviously important to anyone. So there's no, other than the guy who's taking it, so there's no particular reason for the characters to decide to go all out to stop the spear. And that comes up. Like, we see that, Pog asks why. He's like, he's stealing the spear. So? He's creepy. I mean, if creepy is a reason for violence, this team is in trouble. So that's what happened. That's what I think happened. Is the players read the narrative, realized the spear must be important, which I won't deny. Realized the spear must be important to the bad guys, and so decided that the objective was not protect Carva or stop or deal with the threat in front of them, that the objective needed to be stop that guy at all costs. The at all costs thing is the only part of this that I think isn't a character decision. I think that's a player decision. But that's not a criticism. And here's why that's not a criticism, because here's what happened. The fight got hard. The fight got dangerous. And at that point, what's happening is the players are trying to win. And that's what the players are supposed to do in a combat encounter. That's the way D&D is built. A combat encounter is the closest thing that happens to the GM versus the players. Because while the GM is running a narrative, the GM is thinking in story terms. This combat encounter maybe has story relevance. It might also just be a fun combat encounter. In either case, the GM has an idea of what the monster's goals are, hopefully. That's a good idea to have if you can. And a good idea of what the monsters are willing to do to accomplish that goal. And hopefully, I always try to have an idea of when the monsters will run away. This was not relevant in this fight. That was not a relevant factor in this fight. But the players don't know those things. You could tell them. I mean, there's a version of D&D where you just share the players. Here's the narrative purpose of this combat encounter. That's what we're going for. You could do that, and there's probably something interesting there, but that's not how I've run D&D, and that's not how I ran this encounter. The players don't know what the narrative purpose of this encounter is. The players know there's monsters, we're going to fight them, and I've got all these cool things I can do, so why not do them? So that's what happened. That's what I think happened. That's my analysis of what happened. Players might have a different one, and they're welcome to tell me in comments or over in Discord if they think that something else was going on. If you think something else was going on, let me know. What's your analysis? That's mine as the DM. What's your analysis? Let me know it in the comments or over on our Discord. So what could I have done differently? Obviously, I had in mind, well, what was I trying to do? Callan was trying to get the spear and take it away. If you've watched the show, you know that the Stormhammers went out into the jungle. They found the Obsidian City. They found some sort of tomb in the Obsidian City, and we ended with Callan, Hallis, Mirren, and Tommel all laying down on stone tables to begin some sort of ritual. And we haven't seen them since. So we as viewers know that. The players know that. The characters don't know that. So obviously what Callan is trying to do is he's trying to get that spear because it's important for whatever is going on back at the Obsidian City. So that's what he's trying to do. That's the story point. I didn't intend it to reveal Callan, that it was Callan. But I know that it's possible that this goes entirely upside down. And so I don't put someone with a really strong narrative punch in this moment. So Callan is, to a degree, expendable to me. And that's why I put him in this situation, because I knew it was just possible. These players are powerful. These characters are very powerful. The players are good. They know their power. They know their abilities well. And I think they generally play very well in terms of just using what their characters can do. So I knew I was putting Callan in a dangerous situation, potentially. Just didn't really expect it to go quite as far as it did. So that's what I'm trying to do. Obviously, the place where it went wrong is that the players decided they were willing to put every single resource they had into this, including risking their very lives to do it. And I mentioned there, if Callan had played defensively, he just would have killed them all. He had the spells, he had the abilities, absolutely could have killed them all. So what do you do? What could I have done differently? Let's look at some questions, because I got several questions along that line. Laura asks, knowing what happened, do you wish you did anything differently for that fight? And Nathan asks, would you ever cheat to keep an important NPC alive? And Nathan mentions what he would have done. In the previous episode, I think I would have spontaneously added some ability to let Callan, in the previous episode, let Callan escape while dropping the artifacts so the heroes still got to enjoy their victory. Okay, so there are some options here. What could I have done differently? I could have done what Nathan suggests. I will say that for me, there are a couple things. One, I don't like adding abilities mid-combat. I like, just honestly from a game perspective, for me, I like going in with the abilities that I have and not pulling out any cheat codes. You know, I like going in with the abilities that the monster has, and playing the stat block that I have created or borrowed. It's on me to know the stat block, know what it can do, and use it well. Now, if I was going to build an escape hatch in the middle of the combat, I would not have done it the way that you suggest, Nathan. And here's why. To me, leaving Callan behind is the much more interesting story thing. So if I was going to just escape one of the things, I'd have escaped the artifacts. Like I'd have had the artifacts beamed up or something like that. But just as the death blow is dealt and Callan falls, um, because that, I think leaving Callan behind is because he's a storm. We've got one of the storm hammers. The storm hammers have reappeared. It's much more interesting to the story to me to leave Callan behind than to leave the artifacts behind. So that's what I would have done if I was going to do that. I'd switch what goes and what stays, but I don't like to do that. I didn't build anything in like that in the thing, and from a gameplay perspective, I prefer to play the hand I've got and not pull extra cards, to extend a poor metaphor, for my own use. I'm not saying I've never done that. I'm not saying I've never fudged an encounter. I definitely have. But I try not to. And I think one of the interesting parts of being a game master is when it does not go how you wanted it to go, trying to think through what happens next. A lot of questions revolve around that too. Emily asks, did you have any plans for Callan's relationship with the Strikeforce that won't come to fruition now that he's dead? I really didn't, as far as a relationship. And the reason for that is we didn't really build a relationship around Callan. Callan was the least known of the 4 people who got onto those stone tables. We had mentioned him as another Blackwheel initiate, but not someone that the player characters had a relationship with. This is someone they knew from school, but not someone who meant something real to them. So I didn't really have plans for Callan's relationship. I intended Callan to be the one they saw first, just to give them a heads up. The Stormhammers are still out there. Here's, a shot across the bow. So in that sense, Callan did serve the purpose for which I had held him. I just didn't intend that reveal to happen here or in this way. So not exactly, no. But my problem is I had to work out in my head why. Obviously, I'm trying to build towards a threat. Something's out in the jungle. There's a threat coming. And my concern was, why doesn't the threat just come and stomp on them right now? Because obviously I'm not going to build the threat for a slow burn threat and have it not be of a much higher level. So why doesn't the threat come and just stomp on them now and destroy them all? And that was kind of the problem that I was posed, is they did something to really tick off. Tommel, presumably, for one, cared about Callan, and Callan's dead now, so why doesn't Tommel come just attempt to murder them all? Or does he? That's an option out there. What about the people that Tommel is working for? What about the thing they found out in the jungle? What are these things? And how do they react? That's the story problem posed to me. And I can't tell you how I worked it out, so maybe this is not a very interesting thing to hear me talk about, but that's the story problem that was posed to me. And I find that interesting. So, and that happens a lot in games that I run, because I'm not inclined to create an escape hatch for myself when there's not one already built in. Now, what could I have done differently to make that encounter go more the way I hoped it would go? Well, there are a few things. For one, by the stat block that they were, all of the big knights had multi-attack. And when they first hit, I looked at the damage and I thought, this is going to be too much. When not when they first hit, when I was looking at them, when I was reading I took the damage they did a lot of damage, and I thought multi-attack's going to be too much. I don't want this encounter to be incredibly overwhelming because I want it to be a fun combat. So I wanted them to be challenging but not overwhelming. So one hit instead of so much damage. Looking back on it, one thing I might have done differently would be lower the damage, leave the multi-attack. Multi-attack is a better power multiplier because with a single attack, you miss, that's it. Multi-attack, you miss, you get another go. So I think if I was going to try and ease them down a little bit, bring them down with damage, bring down their damage a little bit, not take away the multi-attack, which is what I did. So that might have been an error that I made that might have made a difference in giving them a little more oomph, because I think if I had made them more substantially threatening, it would have forced the people who decided to chase the hooded guy, mainly Ari, to turn back and focus on the blocking force. So that would have been an option for making a little bit more effective as a blocking force. Second thing that you could do if you're me, looking at this encounter and thinking, what can you do differently? Give Callan some legendary actions. The party are of a level where legendary actions are entirely valid. Give Callan, and Callan was of a higher CR than that. So give Callan some legendary actions that allow him to use his turn to accomplish his goal, and then between turns, play a role in the encounter, cast some spells, use some powers from the staff, things like that. I think that is probably what I ought to have done if I wanted to build an encounter to go the way I wanted it to go. And honestly, regardless of whether that would have accomplished what I had intended the encounter to accomplish, I think that would have been a good idea anyway, because it would have made Callan more present in the combat instead of just a moving target. He was obviously the focus of the encounter, and so he was certainly very present. But I think he would have been a little more present in the encounter and in the combat if I had given him some things he could do off turn, either by turning him into legendary action or building him around some kind of action-oriented monster, the Matt Colville thing. Legendary monster might have also come with legendary resistances. I might not have given him legendary resistances, even so. He had very high saves, as evidenced by the fact that he succeeded on most of his saves. And he is legendary resistances I try to reserve for really powerful, important monsters because it feels kind of crappy as a player. Succeed, he fail. You cast the spell, he fails the save. Now he passes. So it can be that can be frustrating too for me as a player, and so I might have given him legendary actions without legendary resistances just to leave the tension in place and not make him invincible. I don't want to make him invincible. I don't usually want it to be impossible for the players to just completely beat an encounter. I don't generally want to do that. There are a few occasions where you might, but I don't generally want to. If you've created an encounter where your story hinges on the players losing, you need to come up with a very interesting way for them to lose, or a way for them to accomplish something else, but not this thing. So another thing I should have done, and this is, I think, would have been good too, is I should have put other people in danger. There should have been other people in the nest. There should have been civilians in the nest, looking at the museum, that kind of thing. And Callan's arrival and the attack from him and the knights should have been a danger to civilians. And that would have forced the players to choose. And that's a narratively interesting choice. It's a good narrative tension, and it puts the focus in other areas. It does complicate the fight. And I ran this fight without a map, and that complicates it a little bit more. But you could do it without a map. You could simply say, all right, there's a skill challenge of getting the civilians out of harm's way. You can accomplish that goal either by defeating the enemies or by using skills to herd civilians, haul civilians, rescue civilians, treat wounded civilians, and that those are some ways you can do that. You could turn the entire thing into a skill challenge, frankly. A good example of that kind of thinking is to look at the obviously on a much grander scale. Look at the Battle of New York from the first Avengers movie. A lot of the Avengers are fighting the Chitauri, but they're also at the same time, at least some of them, are also directing emergency forces, rescuing civilians. They're doing more than one thing. There's more than one objective going on. And I think that more than any of the other options, that would have made this a better encounter, just period, regardless of whether or not it would have made Callan survive. I mean, plant growth totally just knocked this encounter out of the water. Like, plant growth changed everything about this encounter, and no way that I was prepared for that. So this still might not have gotten Callan out. They might have still trapped him. But putting some civilians in harm's way would have given the players something to do other than simply focus fire on Callan, and I think would have made for a more interesting, better narrative tension in the encounter. So that's what I would do. That's the main thing I would do differently. One other thing I could have done differently is have Callan take a couple of rounds of fighting. He had enough hit points he could absorb some damage, and he could put out enough damage that he probably could have put one of the player characters on the ground in a couple of rounds of fighting. So have Callan play offensively for a couple of rounds and then begin the process of retreating. That might have been a better way to play it, but it's not the way I played it. I went with the dashes on the way out, and I probably should have been a little more creative in my response to plant growth, because I just wasn't prepared for that, and in the moment it caught me flat-footed. There are definitely things Callan could have done about plant growth, but in the moment I didn't, and that just blew me away. So those are some things I might have done differently if I had thought through it. But again, to be clear, I'm not upset that this ended this way. I know I'm obviously back on my heels at the end of the episode, but I'm not upset that it ended up this way. This has opened up a lot of interesting narrative directions. I begin to tease at them, mess around with them, and see where they might lead in the next couple of episodes in small ways. But we'll see. So I've thought of a few different options for how I can adjust to this. I don't want to undo it. It's tempting as a game master to go, well, they steal Callan's body and resurrect him. I have a narrative reason why that won't happen, but I would encourage you not to just immediately do that. There are villains out there for that, and if you're fighting a necromancer, then maybe that's what happens, and that's fine. If it's good story and it furthers the plot, go for it. But don't do it just because you feel bad about the encounter going the way it did. Don't just undo the encounter. That's my recommendation. So that's some things I might have done differently. But as it is, played the cards I had in my hand, and I didn't play them perfectly. But there it is. So a few other questions. Emily asks, do you use the challenge rating to plan or at least attempt to balance your encounters? If not, how do you plan them, even if the plans don't survive first contact with the players? Boy, do they not. Sort of. Challenge rating is a guideline. Now, my player characters in this campaign are very powerful, and so I can, throw a CR 8 or 9 monster in without feeling particularly worried. The main thing I have found is that unless you're just going like ridiculous, I mean, throwing a CR 20 or something monster at them right now would be overpowering. But the thing that I find makes the most difference is the number of monsters. Action economy is, I think, one of the biggest power multipliers in D&D. If you have a solo monster, the action economy, even if that solo monster is several ranks too higher, even if you get a solo monster that's considered a deadly encounter and put it in front of the PCs, the action economy is still very much on their side. And the only reason that monster is going to knock them down is if the monster is just doing a severe amount of damage with each of its attacks. But generally speaking, attrition goes for the players. Over the course of a long encounter, the players will, if they're fighting a single monster, will start to whittle it down real fast because they get more actions. So number of monsters, in my opinion, is more important than the specific CR of those monsters. Because 5th edition does bounded difficulty, and that there's kind of an upper limit here. You can get crazy ACs and things like that. And player characters sometimes do get crazy ACs, and that can be frustrating. But you have other options. You can attack other things that you don't have to attack AC, especially if you got spellcasters. But the force multiplier that is actions is a big difference. So the number of monsters, in my opinion, it tends to be the thing that I worry about. Is this too many monsters for them to handle? And if so, can I give some of them something else to do in the encounter so that they can kind of feed in gradually in a reinforcements style situation rather than mobbing all the players at once? So I tend to think very carefully if I have lots of monsters about how they're going to go, and it's not necessarily always going to be optimal because, optimization, you want to take down Esri. Esri's got the most healing capacity of the party, so let's take down Esri, take down Shade if you can, then Ari, and then whittle down Pog last because Pog's going to be raging, so he's going to have the resistance damage. You can do that, but tend to think very carefully about how you're going to engage them, how you're going to divide the monsters among the players, and that, I think, is the more important planning side for combat balance. I pay attention to CR, but it's not my first measurement. And then Emily asks, do you think it's easier to recover from, as a DM anyways, making an encounter too deadly or too easy for the party? I guess it depends on the stakes of the encounter. If you make an encounter too deadly, so I'm going to assume without fudging a stat block, without just changing the stat block. You can just change the stat block. And I have, on the fly, eased off on how damaging a monster is when I realize, oh my gosh, I've thrown this in here. This is too much. I have done that. And I have rarely, but I have occasionally beefed up a monster in an encounter if it's going to go over just way too fast. If it's just going to end in a couple of rounds, and that's not going to be interesting, I've occasionally beefed up a monster, but I tend to only fudge a monster if I realize I've screwed up this encounter planning and I'm going to murder the party. But without fudging it, I'd say it's easier to recover from making it too deadly. And here's why. You just have to come up with a narrative reason of why the monster isn't going to kill the party. That's easier with intelligent monsters than it is with beasts, but you can take the party down without killing them. You can take the party down and capture them. You can take the party down and leave them for dead and have some friendly person come along to heal them. There's lots of options for that. You don't necessarily want to just leave it to saving throws to rescue them, because those often won't. But yeah, I would say it's easier to recover from overdoing it, because you can use narrative to explain why you aren't going to kill the party, even if you defeat them in combat. I think being defeated in combat is a very narratively interesting thing, because it happens to player characters so rarely. Player D&D is designed around the assumption that the player characters will win most combats. You are building combat encounters for the players to be able to win. And I think it's a really interesting narrative when the players get beaten. And I think it forces some interesting character development to lose a fight, or have to run from a fight. And so I'm inclined to say it's easier to recover from Too Deadly for that reason. Then we have some questions from Laura. Is there any creature you'd really like to use but haven't gotten the chance? I've been given this some thought, because there are a lot of creatures that I've never used in a combat. So from a narrative perspective, I've kind of wanted to run a game involving giants for a while, and I never have run a campaign centered around giants. Obviously, we've had giants show up in Khyber Shards, and that may be the first game I've run where giants have really shown up much at all. So that's one, but not necessarily a combat encounter. That's not, giants aren't, I mean, giants can be interesting combat encounters, but they're not a specifically super interesting combat encounter. I've never used a Kraken. I've always thought a Kraken would be a really interesting monster. You've got the tentacle angle of it, and you can do the thing where the tentacles are at different places, and so it's like lots of monsters, but they're kind of one monster. And so I think that would be really fun to do, and to create a shipboard or dockside encounter using one. So that would be high on my list. I've never run a combat with a really powerful dragon, like a high level dragon, and I just, that sounds like a lot of fun. I'm always gun shy of it, though, to be honest, because if you play a dragon intelligently, it's very hard for the players to win. So I think that would be fun, but I think I would need to do a lot of setup to allow the players some time to think about the encounter. So that's that's an interesting option there, but that's one that I've never done that either, with a really high level dragon. And beyond that, I don't do a lot of dungeon crawl. I actually don't think I've ever used a beholder. I don't do a lot of dungeon crawls, so I don't tend to get a lot of the classic underground dungeony monsters, because I tend to run, I don't know, I tend to run games involving humanoids, and tend to take place mostly on the surface. It's just a tendency of mine. So some of that would be fun. But yeah, that's my answer there. What kind of encounter is your favorite to run? My favorite kind of encounter to run is one where the environment gets used a lot. I just really like when the environment plays a role in the encounter, because it's so rare and it's almost never present in pre-designed encounters. There's a whole lot of advice out there on the internet for how to do this, and I never feel like I quite do it well. But that I really love. Whenever that works, where the environment and the space that the encounter takes place in is used effectively by the players and the monsters, I think that's my favorite. What's an encounter you've been really proud of running? In Khyber Shards, the arena fight is, I think, the best encounter I've run. The game aspect of it was really interesting to me. I think it was really interesting to the players. Everybody played into it. Everybody played into it very differently from the way anyone else played into it. So I liked, that's one that is very strong. In my home game, this is difficult to describe. I ran an encounter in the final arc of my first campaign where the fight took place in a bottomless pit, but a bottomless pit in the sense that it was a loop. Like you fell to the bottom and there was a portal that would throw you back to the top, and you would just constantly fall. And the thing they're trying to get, the MacGuffin, is suspended out in this bottomless pit. And there's a very narrow space where gravity is functioning normally. Also, you're not falling because it's under a reverse gravity thing, so you actually fly up to the ceiling, teleport to the bottom, and up and up. And so there was just a lot of craziness to that, and I kind of built it on our table with dungeon tiles, and so that was really, really fun. I liked that. I liked that a lot. Reverse gravity is just a delightful spell. So that's one I'm fairly proud of the way that it played out. So, all right. So there we are. We've recorded the next several episodes, and we get a little bit of fallout from this. So I hope you will enjoy seeing that and seeing the next phase of adventure that the party is heading off on. You can get in touch with us in comments down below. Down below, you'll also find links to our Discord and our merch store, as well as all of our other social media. And you will find a link to Callan's Twitch, where he streams as Sorry BTR. The O is 0, streaming on Tuesdays, and then whenever life allows him to. New episodes of Khyber Shards drop every Monday. New episodes of Khyber Shards Answers every Friday. And until next time, thanks for rolling with us.